Dr. Ramzy Baroud is a US-Palestinian journalist, a media consultant, an author and a columnist and editor of the Palestine Chronicle. He joins us now via Zoom to give us his opinion about the election outcome and the way forward. He's in Seattle, Washington in the US. Thanks very much indeed for joining us and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
All right, so I guess with the election number 4 in 2 years, this deadlock was again a most likely outcome.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of these situations where you're kind of trying the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. Why would have anyone expected that there's going to be a dramatic shift in terms of the overall count of the votes? Netanyahu, whether popular or not amongst his people, his degree of popularity did not go up, did not go down. If there's been any serious shifts, has been within the camps themselves. Like, for example, the Kahul Lavan, the blue and white party, broke down to several groups, including Yesh Atid and Kahul Lavan and so forth. So the center has disintegrated. Even the once unified Arab Front has disintegrated. The joint list has broken into 2 different parties. The joint list, which consists of 3 parties, and another party, which is the United Arab List, ran the elections on its own, and so forth. So there has been some changes within the camps, within the ideological camps themselves. But within the overall formation of Israeli politics, it really remained the same. So more or less, however you choose to add the numbers, more or less you ended up with the same calculation. And they've tried this 3 times in the past, and here's the 4th time, and potentially there's going to be a 5th time.
Will Mr. Netanyahu find other coalition partners to make up the numbers this time around?
Well, of course. I mean, there is the possibility that he would. But then if he does, and for that to happen, the United Arab List, which fragmented or broke away from the joint list, the joint unified Arab list, could potentially join. They have 5 seats. That will give him a majority, because currently the right camp has 52. Yamina has 7. If Yamina joins, they will have 59. And if the United Arab List joins, they will have more than the threshold of 60 that they would need at the Knesset. But then if that coalition is to take form, and I really doubt that it would, considering the fact that you would have an Arab party coexisting with some chauvinistic religious parties such as Religious Zionism, the United Torah, Shas, and others. But let's, for the sake of argument, suggest that it may work at least for a coalition to be formed. How long can that coalition carry on? How stable would it be once they start deciding on major issues, settlements, war, rights of Palestinian Arabs who live in Israel, and so forth? So the chances are it wouldn't really be a stable government, even if, or a stable coalition, even if that coalition is cobbled up by a miracle somehow.
So some would ask, who would be voting for Benjamin Netanyahu and why?
Well, I think this is really kind of the heart of the matter here. For the last few elections, the vote has shifted from being a vote on issues to vote on Netanyahu himself as a person. And I think that's what really has fundamentally changed in Israeli politics. I mean, it's quite easy for mainstream media to come and conclude that, listen, Israeli politics has always been fractious. It's very rare that coalitions actually ever finish their mandate. There's always early elections and so forth. That's true. But what's not true, that historically in Israel, there has been a vote over ideology, a vote over major issues, occupation, war, settlements, social welfare within Israeli society, certain economic trends. That is no longer the case. The vote has been really about the character and the personality of Netanyahu. If you are pro-Netanyahu, you would vote for the right, knowing that you could potentially enter into a coalition with the Likud party that is led by Netanyahu. If you hate Netanyahu, you vote for other parties. In fact, the opposite coalition that stands on the opposite aisle of Netanyahu's camp are not necessarily in any way representatives of liberal democratic forces. Many of them come from the center right, and the right themselves, people who have broken away from the Netanyahu's camp, the likes of Gideon Sa'ar, for example. He's a very much right-wing politician. Now, he might find himself having to sit and talk to a centrist-led coalition, but at the end of the day, that alliance, that potential alliance, is not because they are finding ideological common grounds or political common grounds, but rather because they are finding themselves in a situation where they would do anything to prevent Netanyahu from once again becoming the prime minister.
Interestingly, he was courting Arab-Israeli votes this time around. Was this just to get over the line in terms of votes, or is there a vested interest for them to even consider him?
The sad reality is that Arab politicians in Israel don't have a history of political unity, because partly they all come from different ideological backgrounds. You have leftists and socialists on one hand, and you have Islamists on the other. So they don't necessarily meet eye to eye on many ideological issues, but the assumption is that they have to be united simply because the Israelis or mainstream Israeli politicians are basically out there to get them. They are doing everything in their power to undermine them, undermine Arab culture, language, economic equality, political rights, and so forth and so on. What Netanyahu was trying to do throughout the campaign is not necessarily to get Arabs to vote for Mr. Netanyahu, but rather to break down that potential Arab unity. Let's remember that in the last elections, unified Arab parties under the joint list umbrella managed to win 15 seats. That made them, for the first time in history, the third largest political party. Netanyahu wanted to make sure that this never happens again. So he invested in breaking down Arab unity, and he sadly has succeeded. Now you have the joint list on one hand, and you have the United Arab List on the other hand, and together they managed to barely come up with 11 seats as opposed to the 15 seats from the last elections.
Mr. Netanyahu's court issues haven't gone away, and soon after this election process, he has to go back to court. How convincing do you think the case against him is, and what might play out, and what might it mean?
Well, the case is clearly convincing. In fact, the Attorney General, who kind of eventually faced up to the truth and had Netanyahu face his day in court, comes from the Netanyahu camp, is a pro-Likud member himself. So the case is so convincing that even the pro-Israel, the pro-Netanyahu establishment could do very little about it. But that's what Netanyahu has done, and has done cleverly so. He presented the cases in the court to be a witch hunt for Netanyahu himself. And he managed to garner so much support among his constituents by saying that if I lose, and if I face my day in court, the right camp is going to completely be dismantled and fragmented, and this is going to allow the liberals, the Labour Party in particular, and my enemies to manage to form that coalition government, and as a result, vote for me so this does not happen. So he was very clever, and Netanyahu is very well known of being that kind of technician, or tactician rather, who is able to mix issues, personal, familial issues with political issues. And he has succeeded in making that case, but not enough to actually win with a decisive victory, the same way he has failed in the previous 3 elections.
So just before we started chatting, we heard from the Palestinian Prime Minister, and I just wonder if there's anything in it for the Palestinians, any outcome in this particular election, or is it just going to be business as usual?
Well, I think it's not just business as usual. It's even worse than that. And business as usual has been quite bad for some time for Palestinians. I find it surprising that Mr. Shtayyeh is making a statement about ready for an Israeli prime minister to make peace. In fact, peace with the Palestinians, ending the occupation, the settlements, that wasn't even on the agenda of mainstream Israeli political party. That wasn't even being discussed. Even people in the center are really, when it comes to maintaining the settlements, the isolating and annexing East Jerusalem, as has been the case for decades, not ending the Israeli occupation, this is something that the center and the right in Israel agree to. And there hasn't really been any change or any shift. We haven't heard any lofty promises from any Israeli mainstream politician to the contrary. So I think Shtayyeh is basically repeating the same Palestinian position. But I think regardless of the outcome, regardless of the nature of the coalition, and regardless of whether we are going to go to a fifth elections or not, I don't think it's really going to make any significant difference as far as that coveted peace is concerned.
Going into this election, and some time ago, Benjamin Netanyahu spoke about expansion of occupation in the Jordan Valley. And I just wonder, has that gone away, or is this just something that, almost a card that he's holding in his hand?
It is a card. That's exactly describes the situation, because if he gives, and that demand of annexation of nearly a third of the West Bank is a major demand by the religious parties, the likes of Shas, Religious Zionism, United Torah, and Yamina as well, of Naftali Bennett. If he is to give them that demand now, then what is going to prevent them from turning against him in the future? So he is holding and hanging into this card for as long as possible to ensure that if push comes to shove, it's going to be his saving grace in Israeli politics.
Dr. Ramzy Baroud, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for your valuable insights this evening.
Thank you, Peter.